in the heart of the Arizona desert, where the sun burns mercilessly and the wind carries whispers of ancient pain, two worlds collide in the most unexpected way. This is the story of Aleshanee, a fierce Apache warrior whose heart had been hardened by loss and betrayal, and Thomas Shelby, a cowboy who would challenge everything she believed about his kind. Set in 1950, when the scars of the frontier wars still ran deep and trust between Apache and white settlers was as rare as rain in the desert, their meeting would prove that sometimes the most unlikely encounters can heal the deepest wounds. But when prejudice runs as deep as canyon walls and history casts long shadows, can love truly conquer all? But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red rocks of the Apache reservation in eastern Arizona. Aleshanee crouched beside the small creek that wound through the canyon, her dark eyes scanning the horizon as she filled her water gourd. At 23, she carried herself with the grace of a mountain cat and the wariness of prey that had learned to survive. Her long black hair was braided with strips of leather, and traditional Apache clothing adorned her strong frame, a testament to her refusal to abandon her people's ways despite the government's persistent pressure to assimilate. Aleshanee called her younger cousin, Nailnish, approaching with hurried steps. "The elders are meeting. They want to speak with you." She sighed, knowing what this meant. For months, the tribal council had been discussing the increasing pressure from white settlers and government officials who wanted to reduce the reservation size. As one of the few who could speak fluent English and understood the white man's laws, Aleshanee often found herself reluctantly serving as a bridge between two worlds she'd rather keep separate. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had shouldered responsibility too young. As Nailnish hurried away, Aleshanee's mind drifted to the memories that had shaped her distrust. She was only 7 when her father, a respected warrior named Cochise, named after the great chief, had been killed by a group of white settlers who accused him of stealing cattle. The accusation was false, but justice for an Apache man in 1934 was as elusive as morning mist. Her mother, Ayana, had died 3 years later, some said from heartbreak, others from a consumption that had swept through the reservation. Raised by her grandmother, Aleshanee had learned early that survival meant staying away from white men. "They speak with forked tongues," her grandmother would say, using the old expression. "They promise peace with one hand while holding a gun with the other." The council meeting was held in the traditional manner, with the elders seated in a circle inside the community building. Chief Nate, grandson of the legendary Cochise, gestured for Aleshanee to sit beside him. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much change in his lifetime. "The Indian agent came again yesterday," he began, his voice heavy with frustration. "They want to build a road through our sacred grounds. They say it will bring prosperity, but we know better." Aleshanee's jaw tightened. "What do they offer in return?" "Money. Always money," spat Elder Bidziel, "as if our ancestors' spirits can be bought with their paper." "I've dealt with their kind before," Aleshanee said, her voice steady but filled with remembered pain. "They take what they want and leave us with broken promises. We cannot trust them." The discussion continued for hours, with various council members sharing their concerns and potential strategies. Aleshanee found herself appointed to a committee that would research the legal implications of the government's proposal, a task that would require her to travel to the county seat and interact with white officials, something she dreaded. That evening, as the reservation settled into the quiet rhythms of night, Aleshanee sat outside her modest adobe home, weaving a traditional basket by the light of a kerosene lamp. The repetitive motion of her fingers helped calm her troubled mind. Her grandmother had taught her this craft, along with the stories and wisdom of their people. "You carry too much anger, granddaughter." She could still hear the old woman's voice. "Anger is like a fire. It can warm you or burn you, depending on how you tend it." But how could she not be angry? Every interaction with white authority figures reminded her of the injustices her people had endured. The forced marches, the broken treaties, the children taken to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native language. The personal losses her parents, her uncle who had died in a work accident at a white-owned mine, her childhood friend who had been shot by a rancher for allegedly trespassing. A coyote howled in the distance, and Aleshanee looked up at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow, she would have to travel to Tucson to meet with lawyers and government officials. The thought filled her with dread, but she knew her people were counting on her. She was one of the few who could navigate both worlds, even if she preferred to stay in her own. As she prepared for bed, Aleshanee whispered a prayer to her ancestors, asking for strength and wisdom. She would need both for the challenges ahead. What she didn't know was that her journey would lead her to an encounter that would challenge everything she believed about the world beyond the reservation's borders. The desert wind whispered through the canyon walls, carrying with it the promise of change, though whether that change would bring healing or more heartbreak remained to be seen. 3 days later, Aleshanee was returning from Tucson, her heart heavy with the news she carried. The lawyers had been dismissive, the government officials condescending, and the whole experience had reinforced every negative belief she held about white society. The legal battle ahead would be long and difficult, with little guarantee of success. She had chosen to take the old trail back to the reservation, a longer route that avoided the main roads where she might encounter hostile settlers. The path wound through a series of canyons and mesas, beautiful but treacherous, especially as the afternoon heat began to give way to the cooler temperatures of evening. As she guided her horse, Kaya, around a bend in the trail, she stopped abruptly. There, slumped against a large boulder, was a man, clearly a white cowboy by his clothing and the hat that had fallen beside him. His horse stood nearby, reins dragging on the ground, and even from a distance, she could see dark stains on his shirt. Aleshanee's first instinct was to turn around and leave. This was exactly the kind of situation her grandmother had warned her about. Getting involved with white men's problems never ended well for Apache people. But as she watched, the man's horse whinnied nervously, and she noticed vultures circling overhead. "Come on, Kaya," she whispered to her horse, preparing to leave. But something made her hesitate. Perhaps it was the way the man's hand moved slightly, indicating he was still alive, or maybe it was the memory of her grandmother's other teachings about compassion and the sacred duty to help those in need. Against her better judgment, she dismounted and approached cautiously, her hand resting on the knife at her belt. The man was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with dark hair and strong features. His shirt was torn and bloody, and she could see what looked like a bullet wound in his shoulder. His breathing was shallow but steady. "Hey," she said softly, ready to bolt if he showed any sign of aggression. "Can you hear me?" The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing startling blue eyes that seemed to take in her appearance, without the usual fear or contempt she was accustomed to seeing from white men. Instead, there was something else, pain, certainly, but also a kind of resigned acceptance. "Apache," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Figured this was how it would end. "What happened to you?" she asked, maintaining her distance. He tried to sit up straighter, wincing with the effort. "Name's Thomas Shelby. Was riding with a group, heading to California. Had a disagreement about how they wanted to handle some Apache travelers we came across." He paused, breathing heavily. "They didn't like my objections. Left me here to die." Aleshanee studied his face, looking for signs of deception. In her experience, white men were skilled liars, especially when their lives were at stake. But there was something in his expression, a weariness that seemed to go deeper than physical pain. "Your own people shot you?" she asked. "Wouldn't be the first time good men have been punished for doing what's right," he replied, then added with a bitter laugh. "Though I suppose that's something you'd know about." The comment caught her off guard. It wasn't the kind of thing she expected to hear from a white cowboy. Most of them viewed Apache people as savages, not as fellow humans who had suffered injustice. "Why should I help you?" she asked bluntly. "Your people have brought nothing but pain to mine." Thomas looked directly at her, and she was surprised by the honesty in his gaze. "You shouldn't. I wouldn't blame you if you rode away right now. But I'm asking anyway, because maybe you're different from what I've been told about your people, just like I hope I'm different from what you've been told about mine." The vultures circled lower, and Aleshanee realized that whatever decision she made, she needed to make it quickly. The sun was setting, and the desert could be deadly at night for someone in Thomas's condition. "I have medicine," she said finally. "But if you try anything—" "I won't," he interrupted. "I give you my word." "The word of a white man," she said with bitter irony. "The word of this white man," he corrected. "I know it may not mean much to you, but it's all I have to offer." Despite every instinct screaming at her to leave, Aleshanee found herself retrieving her medicine bundle from her saddlebags. Her grandmother had taught her the healing arts, and she carried traditional remedies along with some modern supplies she'd acquired in town. As she knelt beside Thomas to examine his wound, she noticed scars on his hands and arms, the kind that came from hard work and harder living. This wasn't some pampered ranch owner's son. This was a man who had known struggle. "This is going to hurt," she warned as she began to clean the wound. "Can't hurt worse than being shot by men I thought were friends," he replied through gritted teeth. As she worked, Thomas studied her face. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something different. The men I was traveling with, they talked about Apache women like they weren't human." Aleshanee's hands stilled for a moment. "And what do you think now?" "I think they were wrong about a lot of things," Thomas said. "I think that's why I'm lying here with a bullet in my shoulder." As the last light of day faded from the canyon walls, Aleshanee made a decision that would change both their lives. She couldn't leave him here to die, but she also couldn't take him to the reservation. Instead, she would take him to an old line shack she knew about, a place where she could tend his injuries while keeping him away from both their peoples until he was well enough to travel. "Can you ride?" she asked. "I can try. There's a place we can go. It's not far, but it's safe. You'll need to trust me." Thomas looked at her with those startling blue eyes and nodded. "I already do." As they made their way through the moonlit desert, Aleshanee wondered what she had gotten herself into. She was helping a white man, something that went against everything she had been taught about survival. But something about Thomas Shelby seemed different, and despite her reservations, she found herself curious about this cowboy who had been shot by his own people for defending hers. The stars wheeled overhead as they rode through the night, two unlikely companions bound together by circumstance and the fragile hope that perhaps, sometimes, people could be more than the sum of their prejudices. The abandoned line shack sat in a hidden valley, sheltered by towering red rocks and accessible only by a narrow trail that was easily missed. Aleshanee had discovered it years ago during one of her solitary rides and had occasionally used it as a retreat when the weight of reservation life became too heavy. Now, as she helped Thomas down from his horse, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. "This place belongs to the Rockingham Ranch," Thomas observed, noting the faded brand on the door. "Old Man Matthews died about 5 years ago. His sons sold the cattle but left the buildings." "You know this area well," Aleshanee said, surprised by his knowledge. "I've worked these ranges for most of my adult life. Started when I was 15, after my father died." He paused, leaning heavily against the door frame. Not much else for a man to do when he's got no family and no education. Inside, the shack was sparse but functional. A simple bed, a table, a stone fireplace, and some basic supplies that previous occupants had left behind. Aleshanee helped Thomas to the bed and began to properly dress, his wound by the light of a kerosene lamp. "You're good at this," he said, watching her work. "Where did you learn?" "My grandmother. She was a healer, what your people would call a medicine woman." Aleshanee's voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness. "She taught me that healing is about more than just treating wounds. It's about understanding the whole person." "What would she think about you helping me?" Aleshanee's hand stilled. "She would say I'm taking a foolish risk. That white men are dangerous, even when they seem helpless." "She'd be right to worry," Thomas said quietly. "I've seen what some of my people are capable of, what they've done to yours." Over the next 3 days, as Thomas recovered from his wound and the fever that followed, they began to talk. At first, their conversations were cautious, circling around the deep wells of mistrust that separated their peoples. But gradually, as Aleshanee saw that Thomas made no demands and offered no false promises, she began to share pieces of her story. I was 7 when my father was killed, she told him one evening as they sat by the fire. A group of white settlers accused him of stealing cattle. He was innocent, but that didn't matter. They shot him down in front of his family and claimed it was self-defense. Thomas listened without interrupting, his face grave. I'm sorry, he said finally. I know those words probably don't mean much coming from me, but I am truly sorry. Why? Aleshanee asked. You didn't pull the trigger. No, but I've stood by while other injustices happened. I've told myself it wasn't my fight, wasn't my responsibility. He stared into the flames. Maybe if more of us had spoken up, men like your father would still be alive. And you would have ended up like you did, shot by your own people. Maybe, but at least I would have been able to live with myself. Aleshanee studied his profile in the firelight. Is that why you defended those Apache travelers? The ones your companions wanted to harm? Thomas nodded. They were just a family trying to get to relatives in New Mexico. Had papers and everything, but the men I was with, they saw an opportunity. Said no one would miss a few more Indians. His voice turned bitter. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. What will you do now? She asked. When you're healed? I don't know. Can't go back to the men I was riding with. Word will spread about what happened, and I'll be marked as an Indian lover in every town from here to California. The term hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to address directly. Instead, Thomas changed the subject. What about you? You said you were in Tucson on business. Aleshanee found herself telling him about the government's plans for the reservation, about the legal battles ahead, and about her role as a reluctant bridge between two worlds. She was surprised by his intelligent questions and his understanding of the political complexities involved. You studied law? She asked. Some. Had a teacher back in Kansas who thought I had potential. Spent 2 years at a small college before the money ran out. He smiled ruefully. Turns out book learning doesn't pay as well as cowboy work. But you understand contracts, legal language? Better than most cowboys, I suppose. Why? An idea was forming in Aleshanee's mind, one that both excited and terrified her. The lawyers in Tucson, they treat us like children. They explain nothing, expect us to sign papers we don't understand. If someone were to help us review the documents, make sure we're not being cheated. You want me to help your people fight the government? Thomas asked, incredulous. I want someone who understands their language to make sure we're not being robbed blind, she corrected. The question is whether you're willing to risk being labeled not just an Indian lover, but an Indian helper. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Aleshanee wondered if she had pushed too hard, revealed too much trust too quickly. But finally, he spoke. I've got nowhere else to go anyway. And if I'm going to be branded as something, I'd rather be branded as a man who stood up for what's right. That night, as Aleshanee lay on her bedroll by the fire and listened to Thomas's steady breathing from the bed, she realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The wall of mistrust she had built so carefully over the years had developed its first crack. It was still there, still strong, but it was no longer impenetrable. She thought about her grandmother's words. Anger is like a fire. It can warm you or burn you, depending on how you tend it. Perhaps it was time to let some of that fire burn away, to make room for something else to grow. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the canyon walls, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of dawn. Change was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the rhythm of her own heartbeat, in the way Thomas Shelby had looked at her not as an Apache woman to be feared or conquered, but as a person to be respected and understood. The walls between their worlds were still there, high and seemingly insurmountable. But walls, Aleshanee was beginning to realize, were only as strong as the people who chose to maintain them. 2 weeks later, Aleshanee and Thomas sat across from each other at the small table in the Lion Shack, surrounded by legal documents and correspondence. Thomas's shoulder had healed well, and his understanding of the government's proposal had proven invaluable. What had initially appeared to be a reasonable compromise was revealed, through his careful analysis, to be a cleverly disguised land grab. Here, Thomas said, pointing to a clause buried in the legal jargon. This section gives the government the right to expand the road project at any time, without additional compensation. And this part here, it allows them to claim mineral rights on any land the road passes through. Aleshanee felt a familiar surge of anger. So they're not just taking our sacred grounds for a road. They're taking everything underneath as well. It appears so. The language is deliberately confusing, but the intent is clear. She stood and paced to the window, looking out at the desert landscape that had sheltered them for these past weeks. I need to get this information back to the council. They need to know what they're really being asked to sign. Aleshanee, Thomas said quietly, if I help you present this information, if I stand with your people against the government, there's no going back for me. I'll be finished in white society. She turned to face him. I know. I wouldn't ask that of you. I'm not asking you to ask. I'm telling you that I've made my choice. He stood and walked to her, his blue eyes serious. These past 2 weeks, talking with you, learning about your people's history, seeing how you've been treated. I can't just walk away and pretend I don't know better. Thomas, you don't understand what you're saying. If you help us, you'll be branded as a traitor to your own race. You'll have no place in white society. And what about in your society? He asked. Would I have a place there? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond the immediate legal battle. Aleshanee felt her heart racing as she recognized the deeper meaning behind his words. I don't know, she said honestly. There are some who would never accept you. The distrust runs deep, and with good reason. And you, would you accept me? She looked into his eyes and saw the same vulnerability she felt in her own heart. Somewhere over these past weeks, between the late-night conversations and the shared meals, between the moments of comfortable silence and the growing trust, something had changed. The wall around her heart hadn't just cracked. It had crumbled. I think I already have, she whispered. Thomas stepped closer, and she didn't retreat. I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, he said. I know the odds are against us. I know what people will say, what they'll think. But I also know that what we have here, in this place, is real. The world outside isn't like this place, Aleshanee said, though she made no move to step away from him. Out there we're Apache and white. Out there we're enemies. Then maybe we need to create our own world, Thomas said, reaching out to gently touch her face. Maybe we need to show people that there's another way. Their first kiss was tentative, filled with the weight of history and the fear of an uncertain future. But it was also filled with hope. The hope that love could bridge the deepest divides, that understanding could overcome prejudice, that 2 wounded souls could heal each other. When they finally parted, Aleshanee rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. If we do this, she said, if we try to make this work, it won't be easy. There will be people on both sides who will try to destroy us. I know, Thomas replied, his arms tightening around her. But I'd rather face that with you than face a lifetime of emptiness without you. 3 days later, they rode together toward the reservation, their horses side by side, their future uncertain, but their commitment to each other solid. Aleshanee had sent word ahead to the tribal council, requesting an emergency meeting to discuss the government's proposal. She hadn't mentioned Thomas, knowing that his presence would need to be carefully explained. As they crested the hill overlooking the reservation, Thomas pulled his horse to a stop. Are you sure about this? He asked. Aleshanee looked at the collection of adobe buildings and traditional hogans scattered across the valley floor. This was her home, her people, her heritage. But it was also a place that had been shaped by centuries of conflict with people who looked like the man beside her. No, she said honestly, but I'm sure about you. And I'm sure that if we don't try to bridge this gap, if we don't show people that there's another way, then nothing will ever change. Chief Nate met them at the edge of the settlement, his weathered face unreadable as he took in the sight of Aleshanee, riding with a white man. Behind him stood several other council members, their expressions ranging from curious to hostile. Aleshanee, the chief said, you have news about the government's proposal? I do, grandfather, she replied, using the term of respect. And I have someone who can help us understand what we're really fighting against. She dismounted and gestured for Thomas to do the same. "This is Thomas Shelby. He studied law, and he's been helping me review the documents. What we found, it's worse than we thought." The next hour was tense, as Thomas carefully explained the deceptive language in the government's proposal, while the council members listened with varying degrees of skepticism and interest. But as the full scope of the attempted deception became clear, the room's atmosphere shifted from suspicion to grudging respect. "Why would you help us?" asked Elder Bidzeal. "What do you gain from this?" Thomas glanced at Aleshanee, then back at the assembled leaders. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I've seen what happens when good people stay silent. And because—" he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I've come to care deeply about the welfare of this community." Chief Nate studied both of them for a long moment, his eyes taking in the subtle signs of their relationship. The way they stood close to each other, the protective way Thomas positioned himself near Aleshanee, the way she looked at him with trust and something deeper. "You understand that if you help us," the chief said to Thomas, "you will be making enemies among your own people?" "I understand. And you understand that many of our people will never fully trust you, no matter what you do." "I understand that too." "Then why?" Thomas looked directly at the chief, his voice steady and clear. "Because I believe that understanding is stronger than hatred. Because I believe that love can overcome prejudice. And because I believe that your granddaughter is worth fighting for." The admission created a ripple of shocked murmurs through the assembled council members. Aleshanee felt her cheeks burn, but she lifted her chin and stood straighter, meeting their gazes without flinching. Chief Nate was quiet for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Love has always been the strongest medicine," he said. "Perhaps it's time we tried a different kind of healing." As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Aleshanee and Thomas stood together outside the council building. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be legal battles to fight, prejudices to overcome, and a love to nurture in the face of opposition from both their peoples. But they had taken the first step. They had chosen to trust each other, to believe in the possibility of change, to bet everything on the radical idea that love could bridge any divide. "So what happens now?" Thomas asked, taking her hand in his. Aleshanee smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Now we show them that there's another way. We prove that Apache and white don't have to be enemies. We build something new. Together." Together. As they walked toward an uncertain but hopeful future, the desert wind carried the scent of sage and new beginnings, and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that had witnessed the birth of their love in a hidden canyon. The same stars that would light their way as they worked to heal the wounds between their peoples. In the distance, a coyote sang to the moon, and its voice seemed to speak of ancient wisdom and endless possibility. The walls between their worlds were still there, but they were no longer insurmountable. Love, they had learned, was the most powerful force of all, strong enough to heal old wounds, brave enough to challenge old hatreds, and wise enough to build new bridges where none had existed before. Their story was just beginning, but it was a story of hope. Hope that understanding could overcome prejudice, that love could conquer fear, and that two people from different worlds could create something beautiful together. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.